On a hot July day in Florida, officials and celebrities alike gathered near a swamp in one of the poorest regions of the country to watch something that would become either a terrible tragedy or one of the most significant moments in human history. A former president, suffering from frequent chest pains and somewhat subdued, was there. He had, within the scope of the previous 5 years, won the largest election victory in American history, and also forced to withdraw from even running the next time because his own political party turned against him for a war that was increasingly inexplicable. Within that same crowd, the first man to solo across the Atlantic, Charles Lindbergh, was milling about. Even the host of America's most popular evening television show was there, albeit Johnny Carson spent most of his time complaining about the southern heat to his ever-joyful companion, Ed McMahon, as they waited for the special event. And when that event came, it turned out to be truly momentous. A precisely engineered skyscraper, taller than the Statue of Liberty, pushed a controlled explosion straight down to the ground. The explosion was timed and vectored in just the right way, so the structure and its passengers went up instead of bursting to pieces outward. And the precision was so delicate that the crowd truly didn't know which direction it would go, upwards to the heavens or outward to the swamps. This was the Apollo 11 mission, and it resulted in the first human feet stepping on the surface of the moon. And the system that got them there was built by employees of the United States government using taxpayer dollars and therefore entirely public property. It was public property that was developed by thousands of engineers and scientists as part of a series of designs stretching back to 1952, when the immediate concern was focused on simply escaping Earth's atmosphere. The Saturn V wasn't the end of the line. It was actually the middle of the pack, with multiple later and larger versions already on the drawing board. And those later versions didn't have the moon as the destination. The moon was just the first step in a series of steps that would result in humans visiting other worlds. And I'm not just talking about Mars, but those later rockets were never built. In fact, just 5 months after that first successful moon mission, the President of the United States said in the White House, telling the science advisor he saw no need to go to the moon 6 more times. In that report that was presented to Richard Nixon, there was a so-called option 1 out of the various options that were presented to him. And that option 1 involved a landing on Mars by the year 1982. And it was something very doable, and also something that was studied multiple times over. And now was the time to capitalize on the success and the momentum that Apollo was providing by actually having people on the moon. But that momentum didn't continue. And Nixon made a different decision. And with that decision, America not only gave up on the moon, America gave up having any human presence in any place beyond Earth's orbit for 50 years and counting. This is the story of what destroyed America's chance to have permanent human presence on other worlds, and how we were perilously close to not even being this close to getting back to the moon. So lean forward and explore with me as we unravel why America never made it to Mars in 1982. A beginning. As time has progressed from that 1969 Florida launch to the early 21st century, a consensus seems to have formed around what got America to the moon in the first place. And that consensus points to an origin far outside America. In fact, many say it started in the closing days of a war that destroyed much of Europe. That period saw the rise of a secret U.S. government program to acquire top scientific minds of the fallen enemy. Minds that had developed so-called wonder weapons that had terrorized Americans and their allies on battlefields and cities across Europe. In early May 1945, one of those scientists was wearing a cast on his arm, walking down a mountain road in the Austrian Alps. He surrendered to an American checkpoint and identified himself as Wernher von Braun. He and his team were ordered to destroy technical equipment and documents relating to one of the wonder weapons of the war, the V-2 rocket. Instead of following orders, they buried the materials in an old mine and sought out surrender to the Americans in order to prevent their destruction, while also keeping them out of the hands of the Soviets. He and his team were eventually processed under Operation Paperclip, which was literally named for the paperclips used to attach falsified biographies to the personnel files of scientists to hide their background as Nazis or German officials. Some of these individuals had troubling pasts, but with a penstroke, men who had run weapons programs built on slave labor became War Department special employees. Over 1,600 former Nazi Party members found their way to America this way. Now, the Soviets took Nazi scientists and technicians as well, but they didn't bother asking or recruiting like the American forces did. In one instance, NKVD units and Red Army soldiers moved through the Soviet occupation zone, going to the houses of those on their list, and lowered them and their families onto freight trains at gunpoint. Joseph Stalin, the Soviet premier, considered their labor as a form of war reparations. Two superpowers, two methods, but they both had the same target: the minds that built Hitler's rocket program. Von Braun and roughly 120 of his colleagues chose America, and by early 1946, they were living in former Army barracks outside El Paso, Texas, a place about as far from Peenemünde as you could imagine. In the photograph taken there, von Braun stands near the center, self-assured even in defeat. A few feet away from him in that same photo stands Arthur Rudolph, the operations director of Mittelwerk, the underground V2 factory where concentration camp prisoners had died by the thousands. They came together as a package deal, and nobody in Texas asked too many questions. But that was one beginning, and regardless of what people say nowadays, it wasn't the beginning. The real story begins with a man whom von Braun read about and inspired much of his work. The beginning. 17 years before Wernher von Braun was even born, an American teenager climbed a cherry tree in Worcester, Massachusetts, to trim its dead branches. He never forgot what happened next. Looking out over the New England countryside from the top of that tree, 17-year-old Robert Goddard imagined a machine that could rise off the ground and keep going, all the way to Mars. He would later call it the most significant day of his life. From that afternoon on, he later wrote he was a different person. He just recently read H.G. Wells. Well, most likely he read an unauthorized reprint of H.G. Wells. But regardless, unlike nearly everyone else who had read it and moved on, Goddard spent the rest of his life trying to make it real. Well, at least the space part, not necessarily the aliens. By 1919, 3 decades before von Braun published a single word about Mars, Goddard had already worked out the mathematics of rocket propulsion well enough to publish a paper through the Smithsonian, a method of reaching extreme altitudes. Buried near the end, almost as an aside, he floated the idea of a rocket reaching the moon. Some in the press took it seriously. Others, however, ridiculed him for it. The New York Times read an editorial mocking the idea, insisting a rocket couldn't function in the vacuum of space. Goddard, already shy and guarded, became more private after that. He stopped publishing his boldest ideas. He kept working mostly alone. In March 1926, in a snowy field on his aunt's farm in Auburn, Massachusetts, Goddard launched the world's first liquid-fueled rocket. It flew for 2.5 seconds, and it rose 41 feet. It would look, to anyone watching, like nothing at all. It was, however, the Kitty Hawk of the space age, but almost no one noticed. With backing from Charles Lindbergh and the Guggenheim Foundation, not the U.S. government, which showed little interest, Goddard relocated to the isolated New Mexico desert and kept building. He kept testing and kept refining. Over the next 15 years, working with a tiny team on a shoestring budget, he racked up over 200 patents. These included the multi-stage rocket, the liquid fuel engine, gyroscopic stabilization, and other technical DNA that composed nearly every rocket that would follow him, including the ones to fall in London during the Second World War. While Goddard tested alone in the desert, Nazi Germany was, unfortunately, doing what America wouldn't, fully funding rocket technology, and they were doing it at industrial scale. When the war ended and American officers finally examined captured V2 wreckage, Goddard was asked to help identify the components. He recognized his own inventions immediately. Years later, von Braun admitted that without Goddard's writings and research, they wouldn't have been able to build the rockets in the time frames that they did. A foreign power took advantage of American know-how. Sadly, Goddard would not get to see his designs lift rockets into space or take part in any other developments after World War II. He died of throat cancer in August of 1945. A rocket scientist writes a novel. Wernher von Braun wasn't just building rockets for the U.S. Army after the war. In his spare time at a desk in Texas, he was writing a novel. It was about a mission to Mars, but he couldn't find a publisher in America willing to back it. Many saw it quite bleak since it involved a nuclear war with the Soviet Union, with the use of a space station armed with those nuclear weapons as well. Part of it was eventually published, but only by a German publisher. And they only published the technical appendix, which provided the calculations and details of what an actual Mars mission would look like. But other aspects relating to von Braun were being published in America. In fact, he was turning into quite the celebrity, with magazines like Collier's publishing stories about him, and even Walt Disney producing special television appearances on ABC, with von Braun discussing some of his ideas. All this was taken as a bit of a fantasy, until something made it very urgently real. That something was the news that the Soviet Union, the entity built on Marxist views with the aim of spreading across the globe, had successfully launched the first satellite into orbit. The satellite did little more than ping a tone back to Earth, but what it did or didn't do wasn't really the point. It could have been a deck of playing cards, and it still would have been significant, since the moment you could launch things beyond Earth's orbit, that's the moment you've now shown the capability of basically reaching any target on Earth, should you want it to come back down. Needless to say, von Braun and others like him within the offices and testing sites of the United States military now had a lot more funding. They were also told they were behind and they needed to get moving. The work focused on not only racing to catch up with the Soviets and sending satellites into space, but also to send people up as well. The space race had begun. But before I get into the rest of the story, I want to talk about why there was a 3-month gap between the preceding video and this video. After seeing a pattern of high video viewing on YouTube and then seeing the numbers plummet right after I was monetized, I realized that I needed to build my own platforms to ensure I stay independent and have something I could grow and truly call my own. To do this, I had to learn how to code and create websites, since a website is one of the few areas online that you can actually really control. But when I say create websites, I don't mean creating them in the sense of paying a developer or using someone else's design or services like WordPress to do it. After all, WordPress and other sites like it are just as bad in putting people in a situation of dependence and vulnerability as some of the other companies that I've looked at in previous videos. I had to learn how to build the sites myself, and obviously it took time. After a great deal of digital frustration, I figured it out. Beyond creating a newly revamped Plain Meaning website that came from the effort, a place where I post daily articles, hint hint, I also developed a listing site for secondhand stores and even garage sales. But why secondhand stores, you might ask? Because that's one of the few areas where nearly anyone can make an independent living without having to be reliant on manufacturers or other corporate entities. And it's also where I've seen a lot of gatekeeping in terms of restricting when and how store owners can not only advertise online, but even listing their own contact information. For instance, I'm sure you're aware of platforms like eBay. This website and others don't allow individual contact information to be shared. Listers are reliant on their platform's messaging system for interaction. They try to couch this as protecting you from individual scammers or something else benign. But what they and nearly every other selling platform is actually doing is something called disintermediation prevention, or platform leakage control. The leakage, from their perspective, occurs when the person listing on the platform communicates directly with people looking to buy an item. The platforms don't want that. They need to keep you reliant on their platforms, including for communication. Well, especially for communication, so they could capture a piece of every transaction you make. I'll make an episode focused on this sad reality in the future. It's fascinating in terms of the economics, but infuriating in terms of what it extracts from the individuals who are the ones that are actually creating the value. Anyway, that's why I created a platform for secondhand sellers. I call it Stuff Escape, and my model is a simple one. Be a listing site where the interactions in business happens between the person selling and the people looking to buy, not with me involved. This means that there is one annual fee for secondhand stores and a smaller per event fee for garage sale listings. And that's it. And I make it as easy as possible, since all the lister has to do is send me a picture of each item and the price, and I take care of the rest. The lister's contact information, whether it's a flea market or a garage sale or even an estate sale, is prominently shown so visitors can reach them without going through me. It's something that I hope secondhand sellers will find useful, a one-stop shop for listing down to the item level, resulting in links you could share on your website, social media posts, or wherever. If you have a garage sale coming up or have a secondhand store and want your items listed on a handsomely designed listing website, then check out StuffEscape.com. Okay, that's enough of that. Let's get back to space. Man in space. So a lot happened between the launch of Sputnik and the moon landing in 1969. But for our purposes, the most important thing to know is that the United States government, using taxpayer dollars, developed rocket systems and infrastructure that not only got satellites in space, but also sent men into orbit as well. John F. Kennedy, in his now famous speech, set a goal as the moon for the ongoing space race.
But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Success, as noted earlier, was accomplished with a journey that started on a hot Florida day and ended with footsteps on that cold atmosphereless moon in 1969. The United States had devoted roughly 2% of its annual national output to the space program. With launch sites in Florida, a command center in Texas, an engine testing site in Mississippi, and researchers scattered across the United States, it was truly a national project. Although it was indeed a huge investment, it also came with equally huge dividends. Some obvious benefits, like the ability to leave the Earth and communicate via satellite, came from it. And some not so obvious, like scratch-resistant lenses derived out of NASA's work enhancing astronaut visors, as well as water filtration systems for keeping astronauts' water supply safe that are now being used in portable water filters and some municipal systems. And the plans for what came next, had they been executed, would have brought so much more. In fact, even before Neil Armstrong had set foot on the moon, the United States government was already planning for trips much farther out. From a manned flyby of Venus to a trip to Saturn's moons using a rocket powered by nuclear explosions. The plans were serious and had the math and science to back them up. If you want to read more about that plan for Saturn, I highly recommend the 2002 book Project Orion, written by George Dyson. After reading it, you'll find that a solar system colonized by humanity in the 20th century was a lot closer to reality than you thought. Regardless, this leads us back to that decision in the Nixon White House that I talked about earlier. And his decision came in response to a task force established to develop a strategy for America's space program for the next decade, which was the 1970s. It was called the Space Task Group and headed by Vice President Spiro T. Agnew. The group recommended an ambitious development of space capabilities to include a reusable spacecraft, a lunar space station, and a human expedition to Mars. Nixon threw out everything except for the reusable spacecraft, which ultimately developed into the space shuttle. But the funny thing is, a space task group providing options wasn't needed. A space strategy had already been developed, and Apollo was just part of that strategy, which included what the Nixon group proposed but was denied: a lunar station, Mars, and further development of the Saturn V rocket. So why duplicate a study? And why cancel a program when it's succeeding? To answer that, we have to go back to that earlier strategy. The Future Programs Task Group. That earlier 1965 report, done at the request of President Lyndon Johnson in 1964, and overseen by NASA Administrator James Webb, was much more substantial than the one completed under Nixon. That earlier report included considerably more beyond just the moon and Mars. From a radio astronomy observatory on the moon to manned flybys of both Saturn and Jupiter, the report delivered to President Lyndon Johnson and to Congress was the technical blueprint to execute Kennedy's envisioned new frontier into space. After all, What is a frontier if not simply the edge of human settlement? I mean, you got to have humans up there to expand the frontier, right? Today, many people look at that 2% of national GDP spent on the space program and think only the images of astronauts playing golf on the moon. In the press, the bouncing around and riding in moon buggies was just puttering around. I had some familiarity with space from my time in the Air Force as a space officer. This was before the Space Force. Of course, the only space I got to see was when I looked up from the ground. But I did get familiar with some of the history and operations from an Air Force perspective. I even got to meet Buzz Aldrin once. So at least I got to shake the hand of someone who actually went to space, even though I got nowhere near it. But during my time as a space officer, I was always wondering, why aren't we farther along? I grew up watching a lot of the old programs in the 1960s and the envisioned future that everybody was talking about. That actually never came to be. The larger reality of what could have been and what should have been is found in the pages of that 1965 report that is surprisingly hard to find today. In fact, I was dismayed when I couldn't even find a reference of it on NASA's website. There's a lot more about this report that is fascinating and I'd like to cover, but that would be beyond the scope of this video. Beyond the episodes I'll be posting on YouTube, I'll also start doing premium ones that I'll offer from my revamped Plain Meaning website. And I think a video covering the 1965 plan for space, as well as a deeper dive into the Project Orion book, would be a video I'd want to do as a premium one. If you'd be interested in this, let me know by emailing me at jeremy@plainmeaning.com. If I get 500 people showing interest, I'll move forward with a special episode. But for now, you've seen the two reports. We know Nixon's reaction to the later one. It's time we now turn to what Johnson did in response to that earlier 1965 report. And it's actually through that lens that we finally begin to answer the question, why did we never make it to Mars in 1982? And also explain why we abandoned the moon after spending so much time and money to get there. But before we do, I do want to mention another site I developed as well. Remember when I mentioned how secondhand stores and selling were one of the few areas where people can create a truly independent enterprise without reliance on the big corporations? Well, there is another area too. It's restaurants and food trucks, and basically anything selling food. And along those lines, I created a site called Menu Escape. Stuff Escape, Menu Escape. I didn't venture far with the words. It uses the same concepts mentioned earlier. Item level listing with a menu listing where visitors can select items to message about. Whether it's to ask a question or put in a to-go pickup order, they can select an item and have a pre-formatted message they could send on the message provider of their choice. So if you run a restaurant or know someone that does, check out menuescape.com. Okay, now that's enough. Let's get back to Mars. The first answer, it's the budget. Although I started this episode focusing on Nixon and his decision, the first answer to why America keeps sabotaging its own space efforts is actually found with Lyndon Johnson's response to the 1965 Future Programs Task Group report. By the year the report came out, the United States had taken on an additional 2 efforts of national significance. One was the Great Society program that Johnson had modeled after the 1930s New Deal programs. However, Johnson's version was different, since that had a specific focus of eradicating poverty instead of getting America out of depression. The second massive effort was an ever-escalating commitment in Vietnam, since the administration equated the North Vietnamese as basically a proxy for the Soviet Union. So by the time NASA came out with its long-term objectives and vision, space was only one of 3 major initiatives the president was focused on. And the other 2, Vietnam and anti-poverty programs, those were taking more and more of the national budget. But on the surface, you wouldn't have guessed there was a pullback. After all, the rockets kept going up, and astronauts kept going into orbit. But in the background, long-term study projects and more detailed plans for the later phases got scaled down or deferred. The focus was on meeting the vision of the moon and saving money elsewhere to keep Vietnam and the Great Society funded as well. When we do reach Nixon, we see another reason that takes prominence. The second answer, it's politics. By the time Nixon took office in January 1969, you had a much more complicated political environment, particularly when it came to government spending. The impact of Vietnam and its increasing costs in both lives and funds was weighing on the American public. Although the space program was bringing in technological and scientific dividends, and even bringing a stronger hand for U.S. foreign diplomacy through the positive images of America pushing humans to new worlds, many within both parties were starting to question priorities. As mentioned earlier, the images of astronauts walking on the moon began to feel a little bit detached and less important to the fighting and dying taking place in Southeast Asia. And although we'll never know for sure, you have to wonder if Nixon was against the Apollo program's continuance and the planned follow-ons because of who started it. After all, Richard Nixon lost a bitterly contested presidential election race in 1960 to John F. Kennedy. Afterward, Nixon confided to others quietly that he believed he had won, but that the victory was stolen from him through ballot stuffing by Kennedy supporters in Illinois. Is that why perhaps he chose to move forward on something that was so different from the other aspects? The idea of a reusable space shuttle wasn't a prominent piece of the legacy planning that he inherited. Is that the reason he canceled the last 2 Apollo moon missions, even though the rockets and equipment was already paid for? Perhaps the personal politics between Nixon and Kennedy played a hand. But whatever the contours of the politics were, there was yet another aspect at play as well. The second part of the second answer. It's jobs. When Nixon chose the space shuttle as the only manned program to continue after Apollo, he was also choosing something else. He was choosing jobs. Of course, the Apollo program had jobs, but if you were looking at the politics of the jobs, they were located in the wrong places from his perspective. Those Apollo program jobs were in places like Florida, Mississippi, Alabama, and Texas. Those were all states that were very much dominated by the Democratic Party. California, however, was Richard Nixon's home state and very much a battleground state as presidential and Senate elections go at the time. And the space shuttle, with the selection of Rockwell International, or I guess Rockwell North American, as the prime contractor for the development, that created over 10,000 jobs in California and hundreds of millions in infrastructure development. It pushed the management and command and control of the space program from the south to the west, at least some of it anyway. And after that, the space program became more and more of a jobs program than an exploration program. But that doesn't mean the prime contractors on the Apollo program didn't benefit from the change either. Surprisingly, the cut in their existing program meant more profits for them, not less. The third answer is corporate profits. Numerous academics, to include economist William Rogerson in the early 1990s, found that cost-plus procurement contracts produce inefficiently low production rates. The reason for this, in one way, to put it simply, is that companies can bill more for research and development than they can for simply cranking out already designed systems. With production infrastructure and designs and a supply pipeline process, it's easy for the government to hold you to lower margins because they can simply do the math themselves. For a new program, there's new research involved and things that aren't easily checked from the outside. And these 4 things, the budget, politics, jobs, and profits, have been what's been holding America back every time we're on the verge of a real breakout beyond the moon. The politics and budget of the 1980s kept space centered around Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative instead of going back to the moon. When President George H.W. Bush rolled out a multi-decade plan that looked a lot like von Braun's original plan, it had a space station, a lunar base, and a Mars expedition. But Bush was ridiculed when the estimated cost came out. The country was going through a recession, so most of Congress would only be as bold as the perception of their constituents allowed them to be, or at least, well, as the press would allow them to be. And then it was politics back as the thing that took down George W. Bush's plan for Mars that he rolled out in 2004. But it was a specific type of politics that stopped him, geopolitics. Critics attacked him for looking up in the clouds instead of the wars we were fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as the global war on terror generally. But here's the thing. You're always going to have something important in the world going on or some crisis somewhere. If you can't devote resources for both the short term and the long term, then you won't get very far in the long run. But the easier answer, it seems, is to always say no. So that's it. That's why we never made it to Mars in 1982, as NASA had recommended and projected to Richard Nixon. We're moving back to space again, and we're on the right track, finally. somewhat, because we've got some huge problems with both the Space Launch System, SLS, and the effort to push toward private companies taking the lead. But that will be for another episode. I think we've had enough plain meaning for today. Until next time, keep looking up. Maybe one day somebody will be looking back down. Since I still have you here and you haven't turned off the video yet, I do want to mention plainmeaning.com, where you could read my daily articles and also see the listings of all my videos. Beyond that, I do have one more site I want to mention. It's for a cartoon. I know, just sit with me for a minute. I call it Gromley. It's about a curious tubby cat and his family. My grandfather living in the past, but in a good way. A granddaughter who would rather be at the library than at a party. I like her mentality. And a toy dog that says nothing and witnesses everything. It's my attempt to bring back the funny papers back when we had physical newspapers to contain them. By the way, be on the lookout for a separate episode of Plain Meaning where I dive into the decline of the local paper. And it's not simply because of the internet. There's a lot more to it. I couldn't help but segue into, well, a future video. But in the meantime, check out some nostalgic humor at gromley.com, and it kind of helps balance out the sobering truth you'll find on Plain Meaning. But I hope it's not too depressing.